Welcome to the Software Report, a leading information source on software companies and solutions. Today, we speak with Paul Meinshausen, co-founder and CEO of Aampe, a B2B SaaS company that helps consumer technology businesses deliver continuously personalized customer experiences. By using reinforcement learning, Aampe automates personalization, testing, and optimization for messaging and interactions, enabling teams to adapt to user preferences in real time. The company works with brands across Europe, Asia, and North America to strengthen customer engagement. Paul previously co-founded PaySense, a fintech credit platform in India that was acquired by PayU for $185 million. With a background in behavioral, cognitive, and organizational science, he has led data science, engineering, and product teams globally, and is also an advisor and early-stage investor. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's a delight to be with you.
Likewise, excited to chat.
That was fantastic to read about you. You have a website which is rich with information about you and how you spend your time, your history. And you do have like a very rich background. There's some depth to what you've done and thought about. So maybe for the benefit of our audience, we'll start with your entrepreneurial journey and how you got into tech and founding companies.
So I would say I was not an entrepreneur first. I was a data scientist first. I got into tech because of a curiosity about the world. So I grew up in a military family, and actually I didn't go to school until I went to university. It's called homeschooled, which encompasses many different things, but the flavor in my context was just we were moving around, and my parents thought, that there were better ways to educate than the schools that we had available at the bases we were at. And then as I got older, it kind of became more of just a choice that I preferred my free time. But ultimately what happened was that my older brother, who's about 16 years older than me, was a systems engineer at a Lockheed Martin simulation test bed at Fort Knox, where my father retired because he was also a tank developer. And so I started interning there in high school, and we were basically building simulations for tank combat. And this was the early 2000s. This is 2002, 2003. And this is right as the US had invaded Afghanistan and was invading Iraq. And so I was really fascinated by how these simulators work and combat simulation. But on the TV, everything the military was doing had nothing to do with tanks, had everything to do with why people in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan were deciding to turn fertilizer into an improvised explosive device or anything else that was a part of the conflict. So when I went to university, I kind of went in the opposite direction and said, look, I'm not going to learn how to write better code if the code just reflects what tanks do. I'm more interested in how humans decide to use technology for good and ill, and how do we use technology to help other humans make better decisions, right? How do we help the government in Afghanistan? How do we help the military? How do we help actually local government create better conflict resolution? And tanks had very little role in that. So I went in that direction, and that kind of guided the rest of my careers. It's like, how do we as humans adopt technology effectively and successfully? And I spent some time in the research side of cognitive science, thinking about how the brain works and how we make decisions in complex, uncertain environments. So that was really the core for my interest, and it's been the through line in my career. I've done a lot of different things in a lot of different places, in Turkey and Afghanistan and India and Singapore and the US, Boston, New York, now in San Francisco. But I think the through line has always been, how do we develop technology that lets us make better decisions as humans? And my journey into entrepreneurship was that I was in India leading data science for a big consumer real estate platform startup. And it was super fascinating work. And then because of the vagaries of how startups work, et cetera, I ended up leaving that company to co-found a consumer fintech business, basically a mobile app that enabled lending and borrowing and personal finance management in India, which again is a complex operational challenge, but also limited by technology in the sense that people are applying for loans with very small credit history. And so it's sort of, how could we pick up digital signals and turn consumer tech into a tool that person can use in order to gain a credit history? And I did that because I was interested in the problem. My co-founders were really interested in the business of it. And I became interested in the business of it over time, but really as a vehicle for realizing my technological ambitions and curiosity and interests. And so that company grew, and we were successful in a lot of ways. It was ultimately acquired. I started investing. And that's where I started to kind of really think a lot about like the elements of entrepreneurship that have to do with psychology and how do you build a company, how do you innovate and navigate all the uncertainty of it, et cetera. And then we started this company, Aampe. I started with two other neuroscience, sort of cognitive science background, machine learning scientists. And we built it to kind of build a particular kind of technology to enable consumer technology. But again, ultimately, the entrepreneurship side is a vehicle for what I want to see in terms of innovation and technology. It's not like that my first instinct is to build businesses. Any kind of businesses will do. No, it has to be a business that's very specifically a vehicle for my vision of the future technologically.
Mm-hmm. Most likely there's folks in our audience that haven't heard of Aampe. So maybe this is a good segue to go into what Aampe does specifically.
Yeah. So there's different ways to think about it, but I will describe it from the perspective of us as humans in 2025 and what it means to be human in 2025, because it's a fairly unique moment and the escalation of change that we're all experiencing as consumers, as users, as people in the world. What Aampe does is say, what we've experienced is going from when I was growing up in the 90s, the vast majority of the world was physical. And you would go to a store, you'd go to a Walmart, and you could pick whatever you could off of the shelves. And you go to a Blockbuster and you'd pick whatever movies you could pick off the shelves. And you go to the library and you pick the books off the shelves. So you're constrained by the physical infrastructure. So Walmart in the 90s, typical Walmart would have about 100,000 SKUs on the wall, right? And that felt like everything. And in fact, for any given person, that's way more than you might want when you go to Walmart. Then what happened as the web came along and personal computing came along, and we all got our own computers and our own laptops, and we weren't working on a family computer in the living room anymore. And then as we moved online and we moved into mobile, where we have this device in our pockets, we don't have to go to physical stores anymore. We can explore a much larger library catalog of options in the world, whether, again, it's movies or books or commerce. And Walmart Online has, I think, something like on the order of magnitude of 500 million items. So we went from 100,000 items to 500 million items. In many ways, that's a great thing. More choice, more variety, more ways to find what specifically you might want versus what I want. But the cognitive complexity of that as a human has also exploded. And that means our ability to choose, our ability to kind of navigate that choice, to not be drowned in FOMO and the paradox of choice is a problem. The way we enable all that content to be reached to users is by building software and building applications. So you can go to Walmart Online, you can go to an app. But if you think about it, if you look as just a regular person, you can look at an application and you can kind of see that we design those applications very similarly to how we design the physical world. So you go to a Walmart and you walk around the rows and aisles of Walmart and you find the shelf. And you go to the Walmart app and you scroll through the rows and columns to find the thing you want. And if you and I go to Walmart, we experience the same thing and we have to find our item amongst all the other items, exactly the same path. And if we go on the app, we for 90% of the time experience the same exact experience. So all of the organizational search responsibility sits with us. We've come to just sort of like, that's what we expect. What Aampe does is represents a really deep shift that's happening in software from that way of designing software the way we design the physical world, where you just give a set of instructions, you design the layout, and then that layout is concrete and it's the same for everybody, to a world what we call, Aampe represents what we call agentic infrastructure. So it's infrastructure that has agency itself. And so what it does is actually rebuild itself, recombine itself to present to you the layout and the design that's most effective to help you solve the decision problem you're facing. And so you can think of with Aampe, if a business is using Aampe, is they're provisioning and generating an agent that's sort of sitting under the hood that is responsible just for interacting with you. And so they can change the UI and UX, they can change the language. If you're in a DoorDash application or a food delivery application, you're trying to decide what to eat. You can think about like, you're not just trying to decide between a burger and a pizza and a taco. You're trying to meet some goals as a person, right? You're trying to bulk up and gain weight because you're eating a lot of protein and lifting, or you're trying to lose weight because you want to have less calories, or you're trying to eat ethically and you want sustainably sourced and organic and environmentally friendly, or you're just looking for whatever's tastiest and you're paying attention to everybody else, right? So that burger can be presented from any of those frames. And if you present it from those frames, it's a very different story. So agentic infrastructure and an agent responsible for that commerce can present different options to you, pay attention to how you respond, and then evolve itself in response to you. And that's what AMP represents, is the infrastructure that enables businesses to increasingly build their applications that way. And ultimately, the goal is for us to open something like Walmart and have our own personalized Walmart. The layout is distinct to us. The structure of it is distinct, the presentation of information, and that can be true for any kind of other streaming app as well, right? So we don't want to be told everything about a movie. We want to be told about the plot or the cinematography or the unique brand of humor or who's in it or a particular screenshot that represents the action-filled adventure that it is. That's what AMP does.
Fantastic. And I think you explained it very clearly on what the intention is and how it works. I'm curious as to the types of companies you work with. If you're B2B, are they all in this retail space, all in the consumer space?
No, so you can think of us as being used by any business, any consumer-facing or user-facing business that is trying to interact with its customers over time to help them solve problems. So we're used by a lot of food delivery apps in Southeast Asia, actually in South Africa, in many places. We're used by commerce apps, of course, like e-commerce, like I've described. We're used by the leading tax software provider in Germany and Europe. We're used by one of the major lists, sort of Spotify, like a company called Deezer in Europe. Running apps, fitness apps, entertainment streaming, anything where the business is interacting with its customers over time to try and help them navigate complexity and make choices that create better lives for themselves.
I'm curious about what the most challenging aspect to this business has been in terms of like scaling it. Is the technology similar? It's plug and play with all these clients, or is there a fair amount of customization that has to happen before it's deployed?
A key challenge to scale is actually just keeping up with it. The world is changing really fast and there's a lot of adoption, a lot of interest in adoption, but there's a lot of just nuance to how you execute against that demand. And how do you enable customers to really be successful? The thing about technology in general is technology is a tool for a purpose. It's not a great way of like choosing purpose, right? Like I'm here in San Francisco and 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I think a lot of people in the world, even data scientists would have been like, autonomous driving. Yeah, it's a great concept. It's not really practical. Yeah, the technology is way out. And now it's a normal way to get around, drive around without a driver. But Waymo's not choosing where you want to go or why you want to go there or when you want to leave or anything like that. They're just handling the tactical, onerous problem of turning right and slowing down but they don't solve the what and why and where problem. And that's true in general. And I would say in a rules-based world, in a world where I just design exactly the way I want it, I can know where it deviates from what I wanted. Now, I don't know if what I wanted is actually what's good, especially if I'm serving end customers. And we live in a world where diversity is sort of almost like a social principle, like a value, a deeply held belief that as individuals, we are not represented by our age or gender or religion, our economic class. Those simplified descriptors of us are not who we are. We are unique. So if you have a business with 1 million customers, you want to interact with them in a way that reflects their values, their preferences, et cetera. But what that means is if you then provision an agent for every one of them, so we have 1 million agents, you still are responsible for their interaction with that end customer as a business, as an enterprise. Mm-hmm. So there's a management problem. And there's a kind of problem. It's kind of like any business as it scales. You have to hire employees. You want to delegate to employees to do a great job by using their own creativity and initiative and knowledge. But you also don't want them to do whatever they want. You don't want them to say, like, sell my business, and they go sell, well, we'll do whatever, They have to have guidelines. So what we now require is if a business uses AMP and sort of says, all right, I'm going to provision 1 million agents, how do I manage those agents? How do I give them guidelines? I don't over-prescribe strict rules to them. I let them calibrate and run experiments, but within guidelines, within preferences. And how do I set strategic direction? What do I really care about? What do I really want them to do? I take a streaming app, for example. A narrow goal for a streaming app is to get you to watch content. And that might mean that we get you really great content in front of you. And that might lead to what, many people know as binge watching. Binge watching can be a rewarding, pleasurable experience. It can also have a lot of negative effects. You spend a whole weekend in front of a screen, and when you come out the other side, you're kind of like, oh, I feel gross. And you may not watch again for another 2 months, right? And so that business now has to think about its long-term versus short-term goal and reward. They can increase watch time over the next 2 days. But if that kind of harms you strategically as a watcher and as a viewer and as a person in the world, you may not come back and watch anything for a long time because you're just like, I got to shut it off. I got to cut it off. That's not in that business's interests either. So they have to decide, right? Are they going to push you in the short term or do they want to create a long term? And that's a strategic values-based decision that, again, infrastructure and technology can't solve. So the challenge to scale right now is helping organizations that are complex themselves, large enterprises with hundreds or thousands of employees, with very established workflows, with very clear ways of measuring success. All of a sudden, agentic AI represents this massive change. They have to figure out how to absorb that change and evolve. And so our job is not just to deliver technology, it's to deliver the ability for those organizations to change as they adopt that technology and by adopting that technology.
Switching gears a little bit, one thing we like to chat about is investors and how they've influenced or maybe added value to your company beyond financial capital. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe your partnership with investors?
So it's a complex topic full of nuance. I mentioned that startup where I led data science in India, and it was a really successful company that grew very fast, raised a lot of money, then raised a final round of like $90 million from a leading global investor. And 6 months later, the CEO was fired. Brilliant guy, but like went through some really crazy process, and it was really to the detriment of that company. And I think in many ways, I think the lesson I learned from that was that the investors do play an important role in decision making, and that can be either for harm or for good. Sometimes I have founder friends and where it's like maybe you take a more like just stay out of the way approach. And then there's others that overly rely on investors for advice and direction and sort of see them as a font of wisdom. I think neither is true. In many ways, investors are constrained by their experience. They don't have the operator view, and they really shouldn't try to because it's just not their area of expertise. In my experience, though, they can be a really powerful value add. And you got to be just as careful with them as you are selecting your customers, selecting your team members. You're really all in it together, and you have to be careful. And some of the ways that I've seen them add a lot of value is certainly it's the world of innovation and technology is a small world. So there's certain aspects of networking, kind of just being able to make introductions and connect dots in ways that you might not be able to. Another really powerful one is actually providing that bigger picture context. Oftentimes when you're founding a company, you really get zoned into the detail. You really get zoned into the operational work you have to do. And it's really critical and it's really important. At the same time, to really get where you want to go and for where you want to go to be a big picture that you really want to impact. I mean, you want to help change the world in a particular way. You have to also see that, and you have to be confident that you can achieve that. No matter what your background, where you come from, I think we all go through that element of suspecting our abilities, suspecting what's possible to achieve. And we're constantly facing challenges and limitations and issues and things like that. And a good investor is actually helps you open up the span of your perspective and also have a lot of confidence. The encouraging kind of actually you're on this field and winning is possible on a whole nother level. And yeah, you're facing this problem with that, but you're going to get through it. And the bigger picture is there and it's okay. We've seen these fires before. And that calm voice of confidence is something that oftentimes, if you have an investor, they're in a unique position to provide that. So yeah, we've got great investors, Theory Ventures here in San Francisco and Peak 15 and Z47 in Asia, where I was for 12 years. And I've interacted with lots of other really great ones as well.
Excellent. Last two questions. One is, can you tell us about a person who's had a profound influence on you?
I like to think that, in a sense, I try to live life in a way that enables me to recognize that, in fact, every single person I interact with is capable of having a profound influence. If you really zone in and you're really present to where you are in that moment, there's always something magical. And if you're listening, there's so much to be learned, even from people you completely disagree with. So it's almost a challenge for me to reverse that. It's not like one particular mentor. It's really taking the attitude and the perspective that I'm just constantly open to profound influence. That said, there have been moments in life where it's unusual or distinct. I mean, I've had great advisors when I was, doing research and on the PhD path, in school, my co-founders, our investors, et cetera. Early in my career, I worked for the Department of Defense. After grad school, I came back, and when the US military sent 40,000 extra troops to Afghanistan under President Obama, I deployed as well as building systems, data systems. And I was deployed to work with special forces. So I was in a lot of rural places in Afghanistan, in addition to being at Kabul at headquarters. And at one point, I was with a particular operational detachment alpha team, a small special forces unit team. And these are just 12-person teams. These are just 12 guys that are in this village, like on their own. And the benefit, like the power, is that they're really good at what they do, but they're all by themselves. And so I was with them with a few other people at one point, and I remember staying up all night watching. They were in a small little compound, and we were watching the fields at night. And Afghans in this particular rural part of Afghanistan would work at night because it was cooler. And so I sat up with a particular master sergeant who was on this detachment alpha, and he was sort of one of the older guys on the team. And we talked a lot that night about, this was his fourth deployment, and he had some young children at home, but he'd been gone for a lot of their lives. And he was just reflecting on the choice, but why he took meaning from what he did, and he made that choice. It was a really interesting, and just like me, I was a young guy, didn't have family at the time, et cetera. It was a meaningful conversation. But what happened was, about a week and a half later, maybe it was 2 weeks later, I was back down in the region, and I heard the taps in the morning for a funeral. And I kind of walked up to the unit headquarters and was like, oh, what's happening? And in fact, that team had ran into a small arms fire conflict 2 nights before, and he died. He suffered in that conflict. And it was just like a real moment that, like, if you're going to make choices, not all of us are in a war environment, but I think we are still doing things, and we're making trade-offs, and we're making choices. And if you're making that choice, it should be a meaningful choice. And at the same time, you have to ask yourself, like, am I sacrificing in the right way? So now I have children, and so I also have a startup. Startup can take all of my time. And I often think about that conversation, because in certain moments, I'm like, you know what? It's actually better for me in the long term. My company's going to be better. Our technology is going to be better if I actually take the moment to actually sort of say, no, this evening, I'm with my little ones. So I think that was a pretty profound conversation and experience to go through. I wish I didn't have to learn it in that hard way, but it certainly stuck with me.
It's an answer that is very unique in the hundreds of conversations I've had, and I really like it. I mean, I'm learning from that comment itself, your response itself. Last question, can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
So briefly, when I was on the PhD track, I did a data science fellowship in Chicago at the University of Chicago that's called the Data Science for Social Good. And we work with police departments to kind of try to help improve recidivism from jails. My wife worked in development economics for several years with the World Bank. So I think a lot about those things, but I actually think that the opportunity oftentimes is about progress in terms of innovation. And that, like, sometimes you zero in on the problem. Like when we were in Afghanistan, there was a lot of like drinking water problems, a lot of well problems, a lot of things like that. And you can solve them. And I think a lot of times charities are oriented towards that. But there's other ways to actually just think bigger and hit something that then ends up solving that problem, but not because you directly aim to solve it. I think there's a particular program at George Mason University, a well-known economist named Tyler Cohen, who set up this thing called Emergent Ventures. And the concept was just, let's take brilliant, interesting, creative people who just express that brilliance in the form of energy against a particular problem, and let's give them a grant, and let's just enable them to do things. And it's sort of like the venture capital model, but really applied more broadly to anybody. You don't have to have a startup. You don't have to have all those things. You have to know technology in a particular way. You just care a lot about that thing. And I've increasingly kind of like been drawn to that model versus very today problem-specific focused charity organization sort of concepts. We all sort of seek impact in our own way. And that's just been more my call, is to sort of get involved with those things and try and allocate some capital that direction. And so that's one that I'm pretty excited about.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, I want to thank you again for taking the time for this conversation. It's been a great one.
Thank you.